A sign overhead labeled this platform 3. That meant the train idling just on the track was the one that would take Mitsue to his destination. It was tawny, for the most part. 11 tawny passenger cars with gleaming windows behind a black locomotive. Steam climbed from the smokestack. An engine purred sedately. The stairs lit out at the tail end of the train. A crowd had gathered along the rest of the platform, a sea of gray and red. Soldiers. Mitsue recognized the uniform. A gray jacket with bands of red over the shoulders and across the chest. The pants, too, were gray and red, as was the peaked cap on each one of their heads, a hawk insignia set above the visor. Fear clattered through his stomach. He remembered too well the Anglian soldiers that had occupied Sotsu, their gray and red uniforms and the thunder of their long rifles and their grim eyes beneath their caps. But just then, they were less menacing, preoccupied as they were with their goodbyes, hugging their loved ones, a wife, a girlfriend, a husband, children on their shoulders, fathers patting them on the back, mothers crying. Mitsue had seen it all before, in Layton, when the garrison there had been deployed to Karenya to quell a short-lived uprising. But where are these bound? He wondered. And why are they taking the same train? If Karenya was their destination, then Mitsue would be traveling even farther from the holy city. None of the soldiers were boarding yet, perhaps waiting for some signal, or simply putting off the inevitable as long as they could. Mitsue watched a lumpy, middle-aged woman lick a handkerchief and wipe something from her son's cheek. The son was old enough that the gesture seemed absurd, and he struggled in her grasp, and when she'd finished, he looked around to make sure no one had seen. But there was a sweetness to it, a quiet embarrassment, and beneath that, a tenderness for which Mitsue longed. Now feeling even deeper the cut of his loneliness, Mitsue stepped forward, preparing to board. As he did, an engineer came hurrying along the platform. "Just a minute, kiddo," he called. "Last minute change. We'll be adding an extra car. I've just had word. Those bastards are always springing changes on us." He pulled his green cap off and wiped his sweaty brow. "We want everyone to stay off the train till we get it sorted. Should only take a few minutes. We'll still keep the schedule. Don't you worry." He examined his watch, tapping his foot impatiently. "Ah, there it is." Mitsue stared wide-eyed, for coming down a parallel track was the same black freight car he'd just seen removed from the Layton train. Black, boxy, with no windows and 3 doors, one on either side and a smaller one in the front. With a snap, the track switched rails, and the locomotive began to brake as the car neared. "I'll just see to linking it up and then you can go ahead and board," the engineer said, striding off. A dull sense of dread clung to the inside of Mitsue's throat. Why is it here? All the way from Layton it had ridden, and now it would be following along once more. A kind of black allure emanated from the car, the feeling Mitsue would get whenever he stood at a great height, the open space sinking tiny hooks into him, pulling him towards the edge. And he thought as he stared at it that he heard a peculiar noise from within, but then a train whistle sounded and he lost it. Why? The engineer clambered back onto the platform and nodded to Mitsue. "All aboard," he shouted. There was a general commotion as the soldiers said their final farewells and boarded. Of the 11 passenger cars, they filled 9, officers in the first 2, the rank and file in the other 7. This left 2 cars for civilians, of which Mitsue seemed to be the only one. Wanting to be as far from other people as possible, he climbed into the last car, glancing one last time at the black freight as he did. At 10:35 exactly, the whistle blew and the train lurched forward, beginning its slow labor along the track. Mitsue sat back on the bunk, shielding his eyes from the glow of the oil lamp. This train would get him there. At least, that's what Clyde had said. After that, he had no idea what awaited him. Ignis. He said the word aloud, tasting it. There was nothing left to do now but wait. He hoped the train would go slowly. He was in no hurry to get anywhere, as he realized now there was nowhere he could escape what had happened, what he'd done. It gets easier, Watery said in his memory, and then it gets harder. The pain comes and goes. Drink, he said, and Mitsue reached for the whiskey. He wondered now if he'd made the right choice. Looking out the window, the other track stretching away out of sight, the rails glinting with the silver of the knife on the table. He closed his eyes. There came then a knock from the hall. After a moment, the compartment door slid open, and Mitsue saw the girl from the platform, the one who'd come from Layton, the tall one in the gray robes. She looked at him apologetically. "Would you mind if I sit with you?" she asked. She ran her finger along the door frame, clearly uncomfortable. "Sorry, it's just... Well, we seem to be the only civilians on the train. I don't want to ride with the soldiers, but I don't really want to ride alone either. You know? Mitsue nodded. Of course, that's fine, he said with a vitality he didn't feel. Really? Thank you, the girl said, brightening and stepping into the compartment. She slid the door closed behind her and sat down on the lower bunk across from Mitsue, knitting her hands together across her lap. He could see now the finer details of her attire. The metal clasp at her neck that held her cloak was worked in the shape of a bell. The panel on the chest of her robes was also embroidered with hundreds of small bells. A bell keeper, Mitsue thought. That's why she'd seemed so familiar. She must be one. But then, Mitsue wondered, why is she speaking? From school, he knew the bell keepers took a vow of silence when they were initiated. Dropping his eyes, he saw that she, too, was traveling without any luggage. You really shouldn't stare, the girl said timidly, looking down at her boots.